So this is a whistle-stop tour of our policy legislation. It's a, you know, I've always been taught you should never apologise for a presentation before you give it. But I will make a partial apology that this is obviously policy and legislation. It's a bit dry, but there is a bit at the end that makes it a little bit more real. So bear with me, and I will try to make it as digestible as possible. Next slide, please. So sort of dealing with, I mean, the policy is actually potentially a very big area, but probably the best catch-all is the GB invasive non-native species policy. That is administered by the Non-Native Species Secretariat. So that does provide a secretariat specifically for this policy. The emphasis, it's GB, so it is England and the devolved nations, which makes it quite unusual. And hence the website is not gov.uk. It is immune from those changes. So, but that policy is under review at the moment. That will be its third iteration. So, and I don't think it'll change drastically. But the structure of the policy is very much governed by the conventions, the Berne Convention and the Convention for Biological Diversity. These identify what's called a hierarchy of management. So Article 8H of the CBD, which sort of gives a commitment for each contracting party to manage invasive alien species. So there's a pretty good pedigree to our policy. The legislation is such somewhat more complex, and that's what I will concentrate on. Next slide, please. So this is my disclaimer. I am a lowly ecologist and invasion biologist. I'm not a legal expert, so my knowledge of this does not bear detailed scrutiny. But I will, obviously I'm fairly familiar with it, so I shall give it my best go. Next slide, please. So there is very little bespoke legislation, and what is bespoke is maybe not always fit for purpose, but it's the best we got. Legislation is always a bit of a blunt instrument anyway. And where we struggle is that there's almost no case law. You know, you can, the Wildlife and Countryside Act 1981, I mean, that's been going, you know, now that's 40 years, and you can count on one hand the number of cases we've actually got. And where we do get cases, the fines don't tend to represent the damage that these offences can cause. So, and generally, it's that lack of case law that makes the interpretation of the legislation somewhat complex. Next slide, please. So firstly, put this one to bed. There is no such thing in this country, at least, as a notifiable weed. And I often get people referring to things like knotweed or pennywort as a notifiable weed. You can notify people, but you don't have to. And to be honest, I mean, you can. All you need to do is really record it. But what we do have are the injurious weeds covered by the 1959 Weeds Act, and you might be familiar with some of the actions that are taken around ragwort. But these are all native species, and so I won't dwell on them. But as I say, just be aware that there is no such thing as a notifiable weed in the UK. Next slide, please. So this is the main instrument, Wildlife and Countryside Act 1981. It's section 14 of the Act, refers to invasive non-native species. And unusually, it makes quite a distinction between plants and animals. So for animals, it is an offence to introduce an animal that is not ordinarily resident. Whereas with plants, there are specific plants that are actually described within Schedule 9. There are also animals in Schedule 9, but as I say, there is a disparity within Section 14. There have been changes in that time. There have been now a ban on the sale of certain species, and there have also been provision for species control agreements and species control orders, which the Environment Agency is actually one of the bodies that do potentially have powers under those provisions. There was some confusion over what was defined as in the wild, etc., and that there was a brave attempt by the Home Office to clarify that in guidance that was produced initially in 2009 and amended in 2010. So if ever you're trying to interpret Wild Countryside Act, this particular section, then probably the easiest thing is to go to that Home Office guidance. Next slide, please. So this is the definition of in the wild. I won't read it out to you, but it does. From a fisheries perspective, then you may see a sort of that as possibly being appropriate for a fishery, but it generally, if it's within a garden or curtilage of a highly managed property, that is not regarded in the wild. But if it moves from there, then it's sort of outside of someone's control and management. That is in the wild. Next slide, please. So this is the new legislation, and this is derived from the EU invasive alien species regs, this refers to a slightly different list, and there's some overlap with the Schedule 9, but it puts quite an emphasis on selling, offering to sell, has possession. So this in many ways makes the supply, action against the supply of invasive species a lot more robust. And this is where things like the trapping and sale of crayfish have become an issue. So this is, as I say, this is the new legislation. This is enforced generally by Natural England. So the Environment Agency doesn't tend to have powers under this, but we do have responsibilities regarding crayfish trapping and licenses, etc. Next slide, please. Now, those two that I've covered are really many of the main bits, the main acts, but they actually lack a lot of examples, that they don't have much case law. So I've included some in some ways some more obscure bits of legislation, because ironically there's probably more chance of you encountering these as case law than the main acts. So this is basically, as I say, it's a real catchy one: Antisocial Behaviour, Crime and Policing Act. These are what's called community protection notices, and these are, as I say, meant to be very flexible. It doesn't make specific reference to invasive species, but it has been used. Where, for instance, in a catchment, you may have one landowner that refuses to take action on knotweed or giant hogweed. What you can do is get engagement from the local council to actually take a community protection notice against that landowner to sort of get them to sort of comply with a control program. So it potentially is quite a versatile bit of legislation. Next slide, please. So this is the legal test. So if somebody is causing a detrimental effect, persistent and continuing nature on the quality of life, it's very much based around basically an ASBO, and it's something being antisocial to the community. And it's interesting, it includes a failure to act. So if someone is allowing something to spread, and that's causing a problem to the community, then this is a potential tool that could be used. Next slide, please. As I say, local councils tend to lead. Police also have equal powers, but generally it seems to be local council, and they have to decide in terms of what is at that trigger point at which action is taken. And Whereas with things like the species control orders and things like that, that gives us access, but it doesn't actually. We still have to do the work with a community protection notice. It does oblige the landowner to take action. So in some ways, it's actually preferable. Next slide, please. Now, nuisance is quite an obscure part. It's sort of common law or tort law. So it's sort of outside of what is, our normal criminal justice system. And it sort of identifies three types of nuisance. And the one in particular is private nuisance. But if you go on to the next slide, please. Public nuisance, as I say, it could also be regarded as maybe relevant to the presence of an invasive non-native species or someone's failure to act on it. Next slide, please. But private nuisance, this has already been. Private nuisance, this has already been used. I think generally, I think it's always been for Japanese knotweed, but there's quite a famous case where Network Rail was subject to a considerable fine or costs associated with private nuisance because they'd failed to act on their knotweed, and it was undermining someone's quiet enjoyment of their land. But as you can imagine, what constitutes quiet enjoyment of your garden or property is the potential quite a minefield in terms of how it's argued in court. So this is something that some legal firms are trying to make a living from, and by they're basically looking for things like knotweed and then contacting neighboring properties and saying, would you like us to pursue a private nuisance claim? So this is something to be mindful of, that there's a little bit of a gravy chain for ambulance chasing lawyers. So it's something that I suspect we'll see more cases of, and ironically, it may get used more than the Wildlife and Countryside Act. Next slide, please. So I will let you decide whether that was or wasn't more interesting than watching paint dry. But I will now move on to some sort of real life examples, which I hopefully will be a little bit more interesting. Next slide, please. So this is the invasion process. This is a sort of a stylized invasion curve where something is introduced. It goes through a lag phase where it can quite often appear to be fairly benign. And that lag phase varies depending on the organism. If it's a woody perennial, that can be over 100 years. And so things like Cotoneaster, for instance, we've had in gardens for a very long time, only now beginning to become invasive. But once they come out of this lag phase and they go through sort of an exponential rise, and then eventually they fill their niche and it sort of tails off. So sort of some examples I've given there. The Dvigia peploides, which is one of the sort of the water primroses. This one is invasive in northwest Europe, but it has not, to our knowledge, established in the UK as yet, which is a blessing. The Dvigia grandiflora, which is the water primrose that we're more familiar with, is just coming out of that lag phase, but thankfully, because of the action we're taking, it isn't going through an exponential growth. Hydrocotyl ranunculoides, floating pennywort, unfortunately, we are very familiar with that. And that certainly is going through quite an explosion phase. And knotweed, it's been around for about 150 years, and it's somewhere on that flattening out curve, quite possibly, though obviously, again, it's been subject to quite a lot of control. Next slide, please. So just to give you a bit of an introduction to water primrose, if you're not familiar with it, it's like a lot of ornamental plants that have been brought into ponds and aquaria. It's pretty, but it's not so pretty as a picture on the left in Limoges in France, when you have hectares of it completely clogging up your river. If you want to run through the text on this, Alex. So, ornamental, first found in the wild in 98, commenced an eradication program 2009, And it's been listed on Wildlife Countryside Act 2010, banned for sale 2014. So we do have controls on this. There we go. I'm glad I got that date right. And so we do have controls on this, and we do have an eradication program in place. And I thought I'd just give you a quick introduction to it if you weren't familiar. Next slide, please. So this is a fairly recent map of where the sites are. The green ones are eradicated, and the red ones, they are under management. So you'll see that generally it is something that is in southern, southeastern England, and we're doing a pretty good job at getting rid of it generally, because it's quite a tough thing to kill. Do you want to run through the text, Alex? So we've got, as I say, 47 confirmed sites, and of those, 17 are believed eradicated. And bearing in mind, we've got one site where it's been sprayed 25 times and it's still alive. This is a toughie. It's quite easy to get it down to a very small population, and we managed that at the end of 2019. All known Ludwigia in Great Britain was less than 100 meters squared, but it is really hard to completely eradicate it. So this sort of gives you an idea in terms of some of the problems associated with a plant that we've actually really managed to respond to quite rapidly. Next slide, please. And just to give you a breakdown in terms of the sort of habitats that you'll find water primrose in. And if you do find it, please do report it, because this is one that we are determined to control before it actually gets out into the wider environment. And a lot of these sites are what I call sort of primary sites, either sites where it was either been initially introduced or maybe dumped into the wild, but it hasn't really, apart from one site which has now been eradicated. So far it hasn't got to a river. Now, clearly, a lot of these ponds and fisheries, etc., they are on stream, and so the priority always is to try to make the site as biosecure as possible and try to contain it. But it is a plant that does seem to feature quite often in fisheries. So I would urge you to look out on your travels, and if you see something that looks like water primrose, then please do report it. As I say, no one will be in trouble. We will just help that fishery owner to manage it. And obviously, if they are spreading it, that's a bit of an issue. But if what is often the case is that it is got there through some process that they had no control over, and it's just a case of just working with the owner to try to manage that and eventually eradicate it. Next slide, please. So this is one that we're more familiar with, and I'm sure that we'll be hearing plenty more of it. So this is a different approach. This, as I say, floating pennywort has got beyond a point where we can really have that sort of eradication program. This is more like an integrated plant management approach. So it has been banned from sale, and we are increasingly taking action. There is occasional illegal sale of it, but generally most of the vendors have moved on to different species of pennywort, which may or may not become invasive in their own time, but I don't think their will be as bad as this particular one. We've got a biological control program, and the weevil has been approved for release, but I'll go into biocontrol on the next slide. But in terms of, we do have a GB floating pennywort strategy, and this is a partnership approach, volunteer-led, and we're really looking to try to get all the people, all the organizations involved in pennywort management together, coordinate their effort, using multiple techniques. So each organization brings its own strengths to the table. Organizations such as the Environment Agency tend to have heavy equipment, weed boats, and so we can tend to shift the bigger volumes, but we're not so good at mopping up the smaller bits, and that's where the volunteers are excellent. So it is playing to each of our strengths, and I think that there's a really good story to tell with this particular approach. Next slide, please. So just quickly running through the biocontrol targets. I mean, that you could do an entire evening on the biocontrols, but the top left are psyllid bugs on Japanese knotweed. Now, I won't dwell on those because they're not really doing the business very well, I'm afraid. There's still work going ahead, but it may yet happen, but it's a bit of a disappointing first start. Below Himalayan balsam, there's a rust fungus. The complication with the rust fungus is that there have been 3 independent releases of Himalayan balsam, and they've come from different regions. One's come from sort of Kashmir, one from Pakistan, and one from India. And it's a case of trying to get the right strain of rust fungus for the right type of balsam, because actually the rust fungus is so specific, it has to come from the same host region. So it's complicated, but it is looking promising. On the top right-hand corner, that's Crassula, Australian swamp stonecrop, and the rather sort of magnified disease-looking thing is a tiny little a mite which attacks the growing tips of Crassula, and it forms a red gall. And jury's out at the moment in terms of what level of control that will provide, but we're hopeful that it will do something to manage Crassula, which has been a really tough plant to manage using other methods. And in the bottom right-hand corner, we have our Listrinotus elongatus, our floating pennywort weevil. Hopefully this year we will see further releases of that weevil, and it's very encouraging because it's quite hard to cultivate because it eats so much of the pennywort. It's hard to keep it fed, which is always a great sign. So the adults eat the leaves, and the larvae bury into the stole onto the stems and sort of collapse the rafts. So it's a double hit. And as I say, the important thing with biocontrols, they have to be absolutely specific to their target organism before they're allowed to be released. So to a certain extent, it's a leap of faith. As I say, we none of those are currently providing effective management of their target weed. But if we go on to our next slide, please. The Zola folliculoides water fern, you may have seen it, you may not have seen it, and if you haven't seen it, it's all because of that little weevil there. Stenopalmus it actually is sort of present in the wild. It was introduced accidentally as a contaminant. So occasionally you'll find Azolla populations will just naturally collapse, and they're collapsing because of the presence of this weevil. But if you have an Azolla problem on a water body, you can buy the weevil from Cabby, buy it online and release it. And it is devastatingly effective against dense mats. So it is a good example. It's an example that's often overlooked of how effective biological control can be at weed management. So I think that completes my presentation.
Oh, that was brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Trevor. I see we've got lots of questions in already. So if you've got any for Trevor off the back of that presentation, please do send them in. What I'm going to do now is I will load up yours, Emily, and we will go straight through that and then into the Q&A. As I say, please do pop them in the chat box anytime, and we will begin our discussion very shortly. So I'll just pull up your presentation now, Emily.
Okay, as I said, so I'll be talking a little bit more about how us as anglers and fisheries can get involved in action where we are coming across kind of some of these species at our site. So focusing very much on invasive plants, as kind of Trevor's already talked about. Next slide, please. So Trevor's already given quite a good definition on this, but I wanted to include a slide which kind of made that distinction between invasive plants, which we'll be focusing on today, and also the kind of the normal weeds that you might also come across. So although weeds might cause a problem at fisheries, the focus of today is on those invasive plants. And so those are species that have been introduced outside their native range by human activity. So this might be, for example, in the past through the Victorian area, a lot of plants were brought in to put into estates, into the garden ponds, for example, if they came across them in other countries. And also now, due to us moving around more, there's a lot more accidental spread. So through angling equipment, in the holes of boats, for example, meaning that seeds and plant fragments are being spread around. So that's what I'm talking about in reference to invasive plants. Those have been brought from outside the UK into the country, and now that they've established in the wild, they're resulting in significant negative impacts on the environment, on the economy, but also on human health as well. So that's the focus, and wanted to make that distinction. Next slide, please. So there's many different types of aquatic invasive plants. And so these can really be broken down into kind of the main kind of species traits and characteristics. Generally, you get kind of the submerged ones, so thinking about your oxygenating plants. This is often kind of the water weeds, pond weeds, kind of those ones which we consider as being invasive and have their separate impacts. Then the partially emergent, so the floating pennywort, water primrose that Trevor spoke about, the free floating species. So these are the ones that, if you think of, say, duckweed, similar to the ones that just kind of on the surface itself. And then finally, the riparian species. So these would be like Himalayan balsam, Japanese knotweed, giant hogweed, and these are the ones that are growing kind of on the riverbanks in the kind of disturbed kind of areas, and kind of outcompeting native plants in those areas. Next slide, please. And so I thought I would include a slide also on what their impacts that they have and why they're important for us as anglers, as fishery owners, to try and manage them. So what impact they will have will depend on the species itself, but here's some kind of general ones that I've put down, which kind of collectively add up to summarise some of the ones, some of the impacts you might come across. So if you think about, for example, those riparian plants, Himalayan balsam, they can create really dense or thick carpets, vegetation on the bank, which can make it difficult to just kind of access the water body. Similarly, if you look at that middle slide there, you've got floating pennywort growing on the water surface. It makes it really difficult to kind of cast into, so it can really restrict or limit, as anglers, different kind of where we can actually access and enjoy our sport, essentially. Where you are getting those really dense mats, again, if you look at the middle image, this can result in water flow issues, can result in kind of flooding where it's around a weir or it's backing up against a screen, for example. So just another human kind of impact it can have. Where they are outcompeting native species on the bank, such as the photo on the left there, this can result in bank erosion. So you get Himalayan balsam going, outcompeting the native plants, and then when it dies back in winter, exposes those banks, means that when you get a storm, the soil kind of runs into the water. And again, if you've got kind of gravels and things like that, you can get an increased sediment input, which will impact kind of spawning areas. Another impact is through giant hogweed, which can cause actually these burns. You can see in the right photo here. This is if you come across it with bare skin. Unfortunately, I've had it happen to myself, where you're just going along, kind of getting near the riverbank, you don't realise it's there, and you come across it. And unfortunately, what happens is these burns, they're sensitive to sunlight, which means you end up with this kind of blistering result, which is quite painful, and then it can come back year on year. So just kind of showcase again a different side to invasive species you might not have thought about. And obviously then, of course, there's collectively the impact that they have on habitat and wildlife. By creating these really dense mats, they're outcompeting the native plant species, so you lose that habitat structure, interrupts kind of the insects, food available, the kind of shelter and habitat for fish. and where you get these really dense mats on the surface, that can interrupt the interaction of the water with the air. You can result in localized decreases in oxygen as well. So a whole suite of impacts, and just really wanted to highlight why us as a community should really care about these species. Next slide, please. So as Trevor kind of spoke about earlier, it's really important for us to be able to identify and know what we're looking for, just so we can then really kind of make sure we're applying the right management technique, but also kind of help in documenting and reporting where we are coming across them. So the non-native species secretariat page has a really great resource of free ID guides. So you can access these on your mobile. So if you're out on the bank and you're not quite sure what you come across, you can go onto the website and have a look on your phone. It's got some great images on there. I also use an app called PlantNet, which I find really valuable. So you can take a picture on your phone and it will then compare it and tell you what other species it might be similar to. So if you're not quite sure, not quite confident, that's also a really great resource as well. But also bear in mind, given what I said about giant hogweed, just make sure you're not getting too close to these species. If you are suspecting it, it could be that, just to kind of keep yourself safe. Next slide, please. And again, a really important thing to do is if you come across a species is report it. Again, like Trevor said about water primrose, it's really key for us or for regulatory organisations to know where these species are. One, to help with management, kind of thinking about it at catchment scale that I'll come on to later, but also kind of making sure that we can get out there, control it and stop it spreading elsewhere. So if you do come across something, take a photo of it, note your location, and you can either submit it on iRecord through your phone, so there's an app you can download, or when you get home, go on the website and just submit it on there. As I said, that will get kind of sent off and verified and then sent out to the relevant bodies to kind of consider what to do with that result. Next slide, please. So now coming on to options for management. So these can be broken down into kind of 4 main categories, but thinking of us as anglers and what we can do, even though we can take part in all of these, the main ones I'm going to be talking about will be manual and chemical management. The mechanical does play a part, but that is generally kind of getting a contractor in to come and assist with it, which is really important. But as I said, just as us as volunteers, we're using our working parties, I'll be kind of focusing on the manual and the chemical side of things. So next slide, please. So manual physical removal, it's basically like it says on the tin, it's kind of using volunteers, using your working parties to get out there and manually remove invasive plants from the water. So this is being used, as kind of Trevor spoke about, to try and manage floating pennywort and is part of the GB floating pennywort strategy. The images here were taken from an event on the River Wey last year, and it's kind of working on the bank and from the boat to remove this species, remove it 2 to 3 meters away from the bank, and then it breaks down in a matter of days. So it's a really effective way of using volunteers to try and manage these species where we come across them. It is very labour intensive, so actually there are benefits to using this kind of earlier on in the year, as opposed to kind of later in the summer where the volumes get bigger. But it can be a really effective tool if you do have a willing kind of group of volunteers at your site that you can kind of get involved, know what they're looking at, making sure you include the kind of right management approaches, biosecurity tools to try and contain this species and minimise the impact that it has. Next slide, please. And it sounds like something that it sounds like an unusual thing to think about, what can I do in terms of making a difference? But I've included these 2 slides here just to really showcase through sustained effort, repeated effort, which is really critical in all of these cases, what can actually be achieved. So on the right here is a photo taken from River Kennet. So the first was taken in 2017 and the second was on the right in 2020. So this really shows the change that can occur when you work together. So they did have a contractor come out and do that first larger physical removal, but then the volunteers, the Reading District Angling Association, went out and were manually removing this species down to where you can see it in 2020, and they've got to that final stage where there's now tiny fragments, and they're now moving on to kind of chemical spraying to try and remove those final kind of individual plant species in that area. And on the left here, you can see the example which was taken from the River Wey, and that was a result just from one day of work. You can kind of see the thickness of that floating pennywort sticking out of the bank, and it was on both sides. And yet at the end of the day, through having the volunteers, managed to clear such a significant section of that river. As I said, again, it requires the volunteers kind of going back, and it really requires that sustained effort to get it down to this level. It really highlights how, if you work together, how effective manual removal can be. Next slide, please. And I also wanted to include something on Himalayan balsam, because I know this is a species that a lot of anglers kind of come to the Angling Trust about and wanting for advice on. So kind of Trevor talked about the rust fungus and how that's being trialled, but also you can use manual removal to try and tackle this. The benefit is it has quite a shallow root system, so I don't know if some of you on the forum today might have already come across this. But if you're kind of pulling it from quite low down, it's quite easy to remove the entire plant, and that's very important from the soil. Making sure that you kind of crunch it down. It has a sound like celery. I always liken it to that. Crunch it down, kind of leave it in situ to then again break down in the sunlight. Ideally, you should do this before it starts to seed, because once you start brushing against it at that stage, then it will then send off all this other seeds kind of popping everywhere, which will again result in unfortunately the species kind of being spread. So really making sure you do it early on in the season, so around now ideally, kind of going on till June, and again making sure it's going to have a long-lasting seed bank, so you have to go back and consider removing this repeatedly. And as again I'll come on to later, really important to consider where you are within the catchment and consider if there are any kind of source populations further upstream as well, as part of your kind of management plan. Next slide, please. So the other kind of method available to us is chemical removal. So for any spraying or anything that you want to do near water, the only kind of option available to us is glyphosate. There are cases where you could apply for kind of emergency approval of another chemical. However, this is probably very unlikely to be given. So really this is the main one that we have available to us if you are considering tackling kind of invasive plants in the riparian area or within the water itself. So you need to make sure that you acquire, whoever's going to undertake the work, the relevant qualifications, so you know how to handle glyphosate and how to kind of use it and what equipment you need. And you also need to make sure that you get a license from the Environment Agency to undertake any of that work. It does have advantages in the sense of it can be target specific. So if you're targeting it at kind of small contained plant areas, but if you're using weed spray on a large area, then you will of course be targeting those other native plants around it as well. A really important thing with this is timing is everything. So if you're using it at the wrong time of year, unfortunately, it's not going to be as effective. You will need multiple treatments. And again, it's just that idea that you are using chemicals. So even though it has been tested and as seen as being listed as safe for use near water, it's just one of those other considerations that we have in mind when we're doing management. Next slide, please. So wanted to kind of include some examples of where you can use chemical spraying. So I talked about giant hogweed earlier, and this is one that you can use glyphosate to kind of tackle this. Again, thinking about timing, so really kind of starting it now, April, May, before the plant flowers. And then you might also then need to do a secondary kind of spray later in the year if there's been any seedlings that have then grown up. Again, you're not going to be tackling the seed bank, so you need to kind of do repeat efforts on this, and then making sure that you are considering and undertaking replanting of the areas as well, using native plant mixes just to stop species kind of coming in. I realise that something I should have said about glyphosate on the earlier slide is it's a systemic herbicide, which means that you kind of spray it and then it enters the plant and kind of filters through. So even though if you're spraying it on the plant, it will then kind of extend down and tackle the root system as well, which is why it's something as seen as being quite effective. And also on Japanese knotweed, this presents another species that you can tackle. Again, as Trevor's saying, it's one of those species where it's quite widespread, and it is a really hard one to control. But again, through repeated management, you can at least kill the plants down above the surface. The root system might persist, and that is something to bear in mind. They're kind of considered controlled waste, the soil. So if you do have it on your land, it's really important to note that there are restrictions in terms of how you can dispose of that soil. You have to take it to designated sites. So just really wanted to kind of flag that in terms of a consideration if you are looking into managing these species. There are other management techniques out there as well in relation to this, but just kind of wanted to give the example specifically in relation to kind of glyphosate and chemical control. Next slide, please. And again, as Trevor mentioned, there is biological control. A lot of these are in the early stages. As Trevor said, there is the weevil available for water fern, so for Zola. I've included the link there below in case any of you think that you have that on your site. So that is characterized by, it's the free floating species on the surface, and it often kind of turns a reddish color, particularly later in the summer. So you can get these weevils, I think it's £100 plus VAT for a 10-metre square area, going up to, I think, £375 for 100 metres squared. So it's, you know, a cost, but it's not too expensive. And as Trevor said, it can be very effective actually managing this plant. So it's one, if you think you come across it, something to look into and explore further. Next slide, please. And this is where you come on to this idea of integrated weed management. So really important to recognise that unfortunately there's no quick fix when it comes to managing invasive plants or any invasive species for that matter. Often you need to kind of be aware from the outset that you'll require multiple treatments or have to occur over multiple years, and actually what might be the most appropriate method may change over time. So I was talking about floating pennywort earlier. So when it's, you know, those large stands, that's where we're through the Floating Pennywort Partnership working with the Environment Agency, so that hopefully they can use the machines to come and remove it. But once you get to those smaller stands, that's really where us as a community can kind of really help to remove it, control it, and get those population sizes down. So similarly, this might be and apply for any of your other invasive plants that you have established at your site. It might be that a certain method works when it's a larger population or a certain time of year, but actually then that might change over time as the population size changes. So it's really important to have that in the back of your mind and remain flexible, and also consider the specifics of your site. Next slide, please. And this is where there's actually a template or a list of questions that we have available, which you could use to help you consider what management you might want to undertake and what scale you want to work at. So this was developed as part of the Floating Pennywort strategy, and it's basically these 10 questions that you lay out to kind of go through when you're considering what management you're going to undertake. But actually, even though it's designed for floating pennywort, it is applicable for other invasive plants and easily transferred. So, for example, it kind of asks you about where are you within the catchment. So I talked about it earlier of Himalayan balsam. It could be the same for floating pennywort and all these other species. Trevor mentioned kind of water primrose. Thinking about where you are in relation to the wider catchment. Have you got a source population upstream? That risk of that population in water primrose's case spreading from that fishery kind of downstream. So it might be, if you're looking at undertaking management and there's source populations upstream, it might make sense to kind of coordinate with the landowner, the club that are above you, to try and tackle that location as well as your own, just to really make sure that you're not going to have, after all your great efforts, new source populations, new seeds, for example, coming upstream into your coming downstream to your area. Also thinking about what resources you have available. So there are a whole suite of techniques, as I said, mechanicals available to you, But actually, if you're restricted in terms of funds, it kind of showcases that manual removal, if you have that sustained effort, can really work in controlling that species and decreasing it. And also what other partners you should engage with. So for any management, it's really important to get landowner permission, also making sure that you have insurance in place as well for your working party and your volunteers, but really making sure you're connecting with the different groups around you, because they might be able to assist with their own resources and kind of make sure you're working more strategically, more coordinated to tackle that particular plant. Next slide, please. And something I really wanted to highlight as well is biosecurity. So I think it's a term we come across more now, particularly the last kind of couple of years of the COVID pandemic. But basically, in the case of invasive species, it's referring to kind of any measures that you put in place to try and stop invasive species being moved from one water body to another. And the reason that this is really important is research has shown that invasive plants can survive for up to 14 days out of water, in damp angling equipment, on machinery, on your boots and clothing. So it's why it's really important to follow the Check Clean Dry campaign and the measures within it. And as I said, as they found that invasive plants can survive for those 14 days, there was research that was undertaken which found that these 3 steps will kill about 99% of invasive species if undertaken correctly. So it's 3 steps, very simple. First of which is just kind of checking. So checking your kit, checking your clothing, your equipment, and making sure that if there's any muddy plant material, removing that and leaving it kind of at the bank where you've been fishing or where you've been undertaking your habitat management. Secondly is cleaning. So ideally recommend using hot water, so 45 degrees for 15 minutes. The reason that's recommended is because, again, research has shown that that will actually kill off any of the kind of plant fragments or something that might be kind of in your kit and your clothing. If that's not available to you, as a second kind of option, you can use a dip tank. So if you have that at your fishery or there's one there, then you can use that. Or you can also use kind of cold water under pressure. But that last one is mainly about physically removing the species rather than killing it. So ideally, you'd use the hot water method if that's available to you. You can do that at the fishery, or you can do it when you get home. And the final one is drying. So making sure you leave your nets, any of your equipment that you've kind of been using for management, out in sunlight, UV sunlight, for 48 hours. And that will give it the kind of final whack, and also helps in managing fish diseases as well. So I said this should be something that you should be promoting to your anglers if you're a fishery or a club, to kind of stop invasive species arriving at the site in the first place, because prevention is so much more cost effective than trying to manage them in the long term. But also, if you are undertaking your management, so thinking about Himalayan balsam that I mentioned earlier, you know, it's very easy for you to be doing it. You pulled it up, but just think about that mud, getting the seeds kind of in your boots, and then without meaning to, you might then go somewhere else a couple of days later and actually be spraying them elsewhere. It's really important to kind of consider this whenever you're doing any form of habitat management, fisheries management as well. Next slide, please. As I said, the real reason for it is to kind of stop something like the bottom right photo, where it's about the size of my thumbnail, really tiny, small species, looks quite innocent, but they can reproduce kind of vegetatively. So have that arrive into a system, it can quickly spread 20 centimetres a day and end up looking like something like this. So this is why it's really important in any form of management that you might be considering, to make sure that biosecurity is really at the forefront of that. Next slide, please. And I also wanted to kind of finally raise, it's going on to my last slide, that the Angling Trust, we have an opportunity through our Angling Improvement Fund to fund any fisheries clubs that are interested in trying to manage any established species on their site. So this could be, for example, getting some equipment, training up your members. I talked about needing qualifications for using kind of chemicals earlier. So getting some of your members, your committee, trained up on how to manage these species, so you can actually start tackling them at your site, or also to install some washdown facilities. So I talked about the check, clean, dry, installing things such as dip tanks or getting a pressure washer, or you know, something with a hose and some hot water, something at your site. So then you know if anglers are coming to it, you're going to have something in place you can ask them to use to minimise the risk of that invasive species kind of being accidentally introduced. And so we have Drew and Ian available today. They're part of the panel, and so they're our environment officers, so they can come out, do a site visit with you, talk to you about what the possibilities are for the fund, and then kind of talk through that process. So come the 16th of May when it launches, you're ready to go, you can apply and hopefully get some money towards some equipment to kind of help you, or biosecurity washdown to help you start tackling these species. Next slide, please. I think that's it. Okay, thank you.